Hi, Dave Anderson from the Camera Company. In the past we've talked about the exposure triangle, balancing ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Well, today we're going to talk about shutter speed and get you into shutter priority or maybe the manual mode. I'm here at the Lodi Agricultural Fair and I'm walking around the grounds this morning scouting out locations to set my tripod up later today. As the crowds come in, as the sun goes down, the lights come on all the rides, it becomes a colorful, activity-filled event. What I want to do is I want to capture motion. I want to show people milling about. I want to show the rides in motion. Anybody can crank up the ISO, crank up the shutter speed, and freeze that action. And while that looks nice, today we're going to experiment with motion. So we're going to come back, we're going to take pictures down the midway, we're going to have the games and everything in tack sharp focus, but we're going to have all the people looking like they're milling about in kind of shadows. We're also going to take pictures of some of the rides and show how the Ferris wheel or merry-go-round can be frozen in time or show that motion and have the lights moving and blurring in all the color. So stay tuned. We'll come back here as the sun goes down and the crowds come in and the lights come up, and we'll share our results. Okay, I've taken several images and I have put them together here for us to look at. In our first image, what I did is I used a ISO of 800, a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, and an aperture of 3.5 to take a picture of this carnival ride. Now the ride was moving at the time, but with a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, it looks like it's almost standing still. In the second image, I lowered my ISO to 200, which allowed me to have a longer shutter speed of 1/3 of a second. I also had to raise my aperture to f4.5 in order to get the exposure correct. In doing so, you can see that we have a blurry image of that carnival ride. Now when we look at them side by side, you can see the one that is sharp versus the one that is blurry. The blurred one gives you a sense of motion, and it's the one that I like better. Okay, in this next series, I use this carousel as my example. I've mounted my camera on a straight tripod, and I've used a cable release. This first image was taken at an ISO of 1600, a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, and an aperture of f2.8. We have a pretty sharp image here. In the second image, I've lowered the ISO to 100, allowing me to increase the length of time my shutter is open to 1/6th of a second, and I've still used an aperture of f2.8. The difference between 1/30th of a second and 1/6th of a second is approximately 5.3 times the length. So therefore, I'm leaving the shutter open 5.3 times as long as the first image, which is allowing me to get some of this blur. Now if we look at the third image, still ISO 100, but my shutter speed is now 4/10ths of a second with an aperture of 3.5. I've had to raise my aperture to compensate for the longer shutter. Now in doing so, from the last image to this image, we're letting in 2.5 times the amount of light as the previous image. And then finally, ISO 100, shutter speed of 6/10ths of a second at f4.5. Again, we raised the aperture to compensate for the longer shutter, and in doing that, what we've got is a lot more blur. Now, let's take a look at them all side by side. The upper left is 1/30th of a second, and the lower right is 6/10ths of a second. That's approximately 20 times the length of exposure. Now that may be too blurry, but I wanted to show a number of different stops along the way so that you can see the impact that the time the shutter is open to the amount of blur that is created. I think this represents that very well. In our next series, what I did is I set the ISO at 250, a shutter speed of 1.6 seconds. The aperture is at f9. And what I have is an image showing that as this particular ride hit the pinnacle of its arc, it actually, for 1.6 seconds, that's the distance it moved in 1.6 seconds time. Now this next image will show that same 1.6 seconds, but at a different position where the ride was at, and so the ride was moving much faster, giving us a lot longer arc of color. I think they both look neat, but the idea is take a number of different shots and you're going to find that you're going to get a number of different positions of the lights, and it's going to allow you to find that one that you like the best. And here in this final image, I used an ISO of 250, a shutter speed of 1.6 seconds, and an aperture of f/18. I positioned my tripod in the middle of the midway, allowing me to capture all the lights of the games and the prizes and everything on both sides of the midway in nice, sharp focus. But all the people walking along were kind of blurred out, giving you that feeling of motion and of the activity that is happening here at the Lodi Agricultural Fair. Okay, to recap, get yourself into manual or shutter priority mode, slow down your shutter speed, lower your ISO, and you might have to raise your aperture a little bit in order to cut the amount of light coming through the lens. You might even need to have a neutral density filter. But the bottom line is, and what you're going to do is show motion and get that blur, and it can make for some beautiful photographs. Practice, experiment, and as always, we stop in the camera company. We'd love to talk to you about it. If you found this tip helpful, please follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you on the next video.